Hello, welcome to Bioli Talks. Today my guest is a very interesting young man, a Georgian young man who, as a Georgian, I'm very proud of. He's a full professor of history at the Louisiana State University in Shreveport. And he's the person who probably knows more about Napoleon than Napoleon knew about himself. Let's meet Professor Alexander Mikaberidze. Welcome to Bioli. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. And well, Bioli is one of a kind. This is the first ever wellness resort here in Georgia, and the founder of the Bioli, Thomas Jedlize, he actually tries to develop Georgian wellness concept. And the idea is that in Georgia, as a historian, we had so many, healing traditions here, and we even have songs that are used to heal babies and things like that. So that, we're going to take from Georgian tradition and incorporate with modern medical technologies, and Thomas is trying to create something very interesting with a Georgian flavor. And well, this tea right here is I would like to offer to you. It's a Bioli tea created by Georgian herbs. It's very, very healthy and very good. So let's begin. Where were you born?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I'm delighted on this beautiful day, beautiful place, in a great company. I was born in Central Asia, in a small town in North Kazakhstan, where I grew up. But then, at that crucial moment when Soviet Union was collapsing, my family moved back to Tbilisi, so I grew up here. This is my hometown.
Great, and as I know, you started as an international lawyer, and you worked for a Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia for some time, and then history. What inspired you to start a career in history?
I think, I don't know if I have met any Georgian who is not interested in history. I think by nature, growing up in a region that is so turbulent, surrounded by so much history, we all are inclined to remembering our past. But as all young men, young women, once you reach a certain point in your life and you have to make a decision, you have to decide what's viable. And being in the midst of civil war in the early 1990s, history didn't seem that viable. So I decided to pursue my other passion, which is related in history. And I've told my students many times that in many respects, history and law have much in common. So I pursued a career in law, but history was always in the back of my mind. Everything I've done as a lawyer was in some ways related to the past. My specialty was exploring how the human rights law evolved. So again, a historical endeavor within the legal setting. And ultimately in 2000, I decided that it was time to pursue history full time. So I packed my bags and moved to the United States.
Perfect. United States. What took you there, and where did you start there?
I was very fortunate that I was offered a full ride scholarship at Florida State University, which at the time had one of the preeminent programs in French history. And I'm particularly interested in revolutionary era. So, and that's a period in history that historians define from mid-18th to mid-19th century, which is absolutely crucial to creating the modern world. Literally, many things that we take for granted today can be traced back to the decisions or developments that took place in Europe or elsewhere in this period. So I wanted to understand where the modern world is derived, really. What are the roots of it? And so I started my career as a historian, pursuing a PhD in Revolutionary Era. Finished it, was fortunate to get a job right away as a professor, and here I am 23 years later.
Currently, you're curating one of the largest private collections of antiquarian books, prints, and maps in the United States. Can you tell me more about that?
I'm a doubly lucky man. Not only I'm working a historian professionally, but my other job is taking care of books. And for anyone who loves books, this is as good as it gets. So in the town where I live, there was a remarkable bibliophile who purchased his first rare book when he was 16 years old, and then for the rest of his life he was collecting books. His name is James Smith Noel. And Mr. Noel has a passion for books that very few people really have, and every spare dollar that he had, he spent on buying books. And ultimately he had amassed a collection of over 200,000 volumes, close to 250,000 books, prints. The oldest one goes back to the first printed book in Europe from 1490s to 15th, 16th century manuscripts. And all of this he had as his private collection. He had no children, and that meant that when he was gonna advance in his age, he understood that it was important to keep this collection intact. And so he's offered it to my university, to Louisiana State University, which built a special building for it. And here I was the fortunately selected as the curator of it. So it's an incredible place. Just imagine being surrounded by books that span some 500 years of print history on over 120 different topics. Anything you want, it's probably there.
They built a special building for the book collection.
Yeah, we have an amazing library.
That's impressive, and I really appreciate when I hear something like that. That's very important. Out of all the history we have around the world, why Napoleon?
I would maybe broaden the question and say why Revolutionary Era, because Napoleon would not have been Napoleon without revolution. If not for the tremendous change that takes place in France in 1789 and in subsequent years, Napoleon would have been just an obscure artillery officer who would have probably peaked as a captain. So Revolutionary Era, why Revolutionary Era? Well, because in many respects, everything that we take around us for granted comes from this period. From politics, and we are living in a very politically turbulent moment in history, certainly in Georgian history. The political ideologies, conservatism, liberalism, radicalism, socialism, all of this can be traced back to French Revolution. Revolution is a forge in which these ideas are created, kind of experimented with, and then sent out into the wider world. The revolution is also a period when we can talk about the creation of the modern state. If nothing else, for example, Napoleon, as a manifestation of French Revolution, is responsible for creation of what we now call the modern police state, surveillance state. The administrative structure of the state, the bureaucratic kind of efficiency of the state, all of this are Napoleonic innovations.
I'm sure you will agree. My first introduction to Napoleon was as I was a little kid, and I watched this Georgian movie, The Mameluke.
Oh yes, oh yes.
And I remember there's a memorable scene in that movie where Napoleon is standing in front of the Giza pyramid with his army, and he declares to his troops, the 40 centuries are looking down on you from these pyramids. First of all, before we get to the question, is that true? He did really say that?
We have contemporary eyewitness accounts of him giving a speech. The question is how many people would have heard him. Every time I go to the demonstration, if you're standing in the back, no one hears.
Good point. And so, speaking of Napoleon being in Egypt, how do you think Napoleon's Egyptian campaign helped to shape modern relationship between Middle East and Europe?
It is actually, in many respects, the beginning of modern Middle East. In my own writings, I point out that Napoleon's decision to take some 20,000 troops to Egypt on this remarkable campaign is a first example of liberal imperialism. And what I mean by this is that conquests have been taking place as long as humans have been around. But the excuse for the conquest usually were the good old plunder, territorial expansion. But what Napoleon does, or to be kind of more precise, what French do, because Napoleon is not a decision maker yet, but what French government does is it justifies its expansion on behalf of spreading democracy, ideals of the French Revolution. It promises emancipation, it promises bringing the benefits of French Revolution to the wider world. Of course, the campaign goes very differently, right? So Napoleon promises to bring all the benefits of French Revolution. He sets up first printing press, he tries to emancipate slaves, but ultimately when he realizes that these reforms are not working and he faces a local resistance, he actually reverts back to this kind of old-fashioned imperial conquest. So when the Egyptians rebelled in October of 1798, Napoleon uses a big stick, right, the guns to beat them down. But ultimately we know that Napoleon is defeated, so he's forced to leave. And what happens is it creates a vacuum for the first time in many, many centuries, because we have to remember that Egypt was ruled before Napoleon came by the Mamluks, and then by the Ottomans, who came to dislodge Mamluks, but ultimately were not successful and created this symbiotic relationship. So Mamluks ruled Egypt since 1250, so that's almost 700 plus years of the Mamluk presence that Napoleon erases. So it creates a political vacuum that has to be filled. And it is, of course, filled by a maverick warlord, Muhammad Ali. And one of the important legacies of Napoleon and then, of course, Muhammad Ali is the realization that the old way of life is unsustainable and that something new has to come. And that new needs to be informed by a combination of drawing from the traditions, cultural kind of milieu of Egypt, but also in drawing modernization and westernization from Europe. And so that's what Muhammad Ali is creating, modernized, westernized Egypt that will go on to reshape the Middle East. It is the Egypt that becomes the strongest power in the region to the degree that it's capable of defeating Ottoman Empire in 1830s. So the rest is, of course, history.
Speaking of history and learning from history, most of your works are related to conflicts. And how much do you think world and mankind learns from its history and mistakes?
To a certain degree, I think, and I think that's a very apt observation that how much can we really learn from history? I think there are some examples of us learning and applying lessons. For example, back in 2007, 2008, when the United States was experiencing a financial crisis, it was very fortunate for the United States to have Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Bernanke, who was actually expert on the Great Depression. So he understood the lessons, or the mistakes to be precise, what was done back in 1929, 1930, and made sure that we don't repeat them. But I think the larger problem of learning from history is that even though we think of history as repeating itself, history rarely really repeats itself. We can identify, therefore, themes, big kind of narrative. But of course, the fundamental problem is the human nature. The human nature is very inconstant, and decisions that humans make oftentimes vary, even within the same circumstances. So I think, broadly speaking, we can learn, but in order to prevent mistakes of the past, you need willpower, knowledge, commitment. You need to have a lot of elements in place, and oftentimes these elements are not necessarily converging.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. Well, Napoleon is a pretty popular figure, and be part of the popular culture. What do you think, and what do you find most misunderstood about Napoleonic era in a popular narratives?
Several things, I think. One, of course, much of what we know about Napoleon is a myth, right? It's a legend of his own creation, legend that is later on is cultivated by the French state during the Second Empire, and then it really expanded by the nostalgia that many Frenchmen felt for it. So it is very important to look beyond the myth. And it's not just about Napoleon. In fact, I would say Napoleon maybe is a good example of what we know about Napoleon being kind of reflective of a legend rather than of actual history. And that's only underscores how important it is to look beyond myths. But the second thing is to at the scale of the man. Oftentimes we think of Napoleon as a figure of European continental scale, but he's really of global importance. And so the books, last couple of books I've written, an attempt to really showcase not just the impact of Napoleonic era on Europe, but on the globe, on the world as a whole.
Yeah, and well, as you know, I did intensive research on life and legacy of Georgian American aircraft designer Alexander Kartveli. That was my little part of historical research I did for bringing back the history and the story of this person. I'm sure you'll agree, when you work on somebody's life so much, you always have this, well, I wish I could meet the person, like talk to the person. And what would be like 3 questions? If you had the chance to meet Napoleon, what would be 3 questions you would ask him?
Oh, that's a great question. Partly, I think, answerable question in that with the artificial intelligence, I think we are heading in the direction of...
That's scary.
Yeah, right? Where I think in 5-10 years, we'll be able to create chatbots that will be perfectly capable of replicating experience of talking to a historical being.
Don't forget what you said. Can you imagine sentence what you just said like 10 years ago?
Yeah.
In 5 years, we'll be able to talk to Napoleon. Sorry.
No, we're living in a remarkable moment. But I'm saying this because just recently a group of historians led by my colleagues and friends, we finished publishing every letter that we could find of Napoleon. So we have tens of thousands of letters. So if you imagine creating a machine that feeds on these letters and kind of understands the patterns, understands the writing, speaking, and thinking patterns of Napoleon, I think it's completely feasible that in a few years' time, our history education will be very different. So instead of me talking, I'll just say, here, meet Napoleon.
Yeah, but before we get there, 3 questions.
So the 3 questions I would ask, why Spain? Of course, his decision in 1808 to invade Spain has remarkable consequences both for Spain, but more crucially for the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. So it's a decision of enormous consequences. The second question I would say it would be why Russia? Because second crucial mistake he commits after going to Spain is going to Russia without solving Spain. So these are interconnected questions. And I think the third question would be ultimately what he wanted to accomplish. Because having read tens of thousands of letters, I would say being part of that project, I've read well over 40,000 of his letters. I still sometimes struggle to understand what was the ultimate goal. Universal empire, European Union style confederation. Is it a global empire? At the different points of his life, I think he speaks of different objectives, but I don't think I have a clear idea.
You know so much about Napoleon, he probably will have more questions to you about himself. The Historical Dictionary of Georgia, Peter Bagration, the best Georgian general of Napoleonic Wars. You wrote many books dedicated to Georgian history. You're Georgian yourself. Why do you think world should know more about the history of a small country called Georgia?
Because Georgian history is one of the longest, one of the richest histories, and I think studying Georgian history adds to the wider richness, complexity of history. So usually when I meet my freshman students and I teach history and methods and methodology of history, I tell them that to think of history as a toy that very few of them play nowadays, and that is, of course, kaleidoscope, right? It's a tube that is full of different pieces, different color pieces, and as you turn the tube, it creates a rich, complex image. So history to me is like this. When we look back into the past, we need to examine human experience because history is not dates. History is not rote memorization of some statistic. History is, at its richness, human experience. And the more pieces we put in the kaleidoscope, the more that experience comes Imagine just having white pieces in this kaleidoscope and keep rotating it. It's just a blank image. So Georgian history has a lot to offer. This is a region where we see some of the early hominids making a transition from one way of life to a different. This is the region where we see the domestication of grape, creation of wine. This is one of the earliest regions of agricultural production, metallurgy, and so on and so on. Right? The richness of this region, in terms of what we can learn, is absolutely astonishing, and it is partly, I think, selfish because of me to want to publicize this region, because as a Georgian, I want the world to know that there is a small nation. There are only 3.5 million of us. This is an average, I guess, city in the United States and probably a village in China.
Exactly.
But I want people to know that there is a part of the world that has contributed greatly to the human experience.
What challenges do you face while balancing historical research, teaching, and writing?
I think time management is the crucial one, because you have to make sure that you devote sufficient time to your research, to teaching, to writing. I'm of the opinion that if you are a good researcher, you're also a good teacher, because your teaching reflects your research. So I know of many teachers who are just good at conveying this information, but I think the richness of your teaching experience will be much better if you're also a researcher. You don't have to be a researcher full-time. You don't have to write full, 500-600 page books, but that part of your inquisitiveness, the search for knowledge, needs to be part of your pedagogy. But one of the challenges that you'll find in researching and teaching is actually grappling with what I was alluding to earlier, and that is myths, because a lot of students, even in the United States, when they come to my courses, they come with certain preconceptions. These are things that society takes for granted. And one of the first things I try to clarify to them is that there are certain things that we can put in the category of heritage, and heritage sometimes is assumed to be a history. It looks like history, it feels like history. It's all about your kind of experience, your past, what your community went through, but it is not history, because heritage usually is all the good things that we remember. History should be much more critical, right? It needs to point out the jagged edges of the heritage. And so that balancing act between heritage and history oftentimes is difficult, because in some places you encounter political pressure, in some places you encounter societal pressure to kind of smooth your approach to historical inquiry.
Historical figure or figures besides Napoleon that inspired you greatly?
Well, there are quite a few. Some of them are literary figures. For example, I still hope to see a substantive English language biography of Vazha Pshavela, right? And that's, again, going back to your question, right, of why study Georgian history. Anyone who reads Pshavela's poetry understands the richness, the philosophical richness of what he was trying to convey.
He was an amazing
to go along on this journey, right? And we only have one chance in this life to go along this journey, not to understand the richness of that philosophical inquiry. I think it will be a really sad experience. So another figure that really inspires me and interests me is actually King Erekle of Kartli-Kakheti, Eastern Georgia. In fact, the reason I'm here is because I received a grant to come to research his life. And I think his life is a good example of what you were asking a couple of minutes ago, and that is he's not a figure that is limited to simply Eastern Georgia. His magnitude, his scale of things that he attempted transcends not Caucasus, and we can trace his influence across the Near East. So my hope is to complete this project and really to showcase that Caucasus, in the 18th century at least, should not be studied in isolation. And that applies to the history of Georgia too. This is intertwined narratives, and that a lot of things that happen here are reflections of much larger processes.
one of the biggest passions of legendary Stanley Kubrick was to make film about Napoleon. I'm sure you know about that. And he wrote a script, end of 60s, he wrote a script, and he, as I know, he did a intensive research for several years.
Yes.
But he never made a film.
Yes.
On the other hand, last year we had Ridley Scott made
you had to mention him?
Yeah, see, that's it. I know, I see your reaction now. Well, didn't really receive great reviews. Then I, researched a little bit. Over 200 movies are made on the subject, not on Napoleon, but the subject. Maybe few of them stand out. Why do you think Napoleon remains such a challenge subject for filmmakers? What's going on there?
I think part of the answer is that Napoleon's, the scale of the figure, kind of the historical individual that he is, very hard to convey in just 2 hours, let's say 2.5 hours. And I think that's one of the mistakes that Ridley Scott did made in his movies, that he tried to cram Napoleon's entire life in one feature film. It's impossible. So he would have maybe done better had he followed Abel Gance, one of the giants of early cinema in 1920s, when he did a film on early life of Napoleon, or he did a second film just on one of Napoleon's great victories, Austerlitz. In essence, figures like Napoleon need to be dealt in kind of compartmentalized, right? You look at one particular moment in his life and see what that moment tells us about who he was or what was his impact. Otherwise, making a movie about a man who at the height of the empire ruled everything from the mountains of Portugal to the valley, the frozen valleys of Poland, from the Skagerrak Straits all the way down to the Adriatic, right? All of this are part of the domain that this single will bent to itself. It's very hard. And the second, I think, problem is that even though we have a lot of correspondence from Napoleon, it is, I think, we need to find a person who can craft a story that will understand the complexity of who he was as a human being, and especially to convey that on the screen. There are some successful attempts, I think, to do that, but not recently, unfortunately.
And speaking of films, as I mentioned, Alexandre Cartel, the aircraft designer, when I was researching his life, one of the interviews I read, conducted by Columbia University, he says that one of the biggest challenges of the aircraft designer is when Army orders the plane and they want the flying tank, right? They don't care about how beautiful it is, they want the destruction machine. And as a designer, you want your plane to be beautiful and nice. And so that was always a biggest challenge between the Army and designers. And now we're talking about, if we take that into a historical films, I think it's very close relationship between director and the historian, because for historian, facts are important. Historical accuracy is important. For the director, film should be
story, right?
Story, and it has to have a dramaturgic, the line and everything. So, how do you think that balance should be found?
Well, there are good examples of it. I don't know if you've read Hilary Mantel, one of the probably most talented and successful British writers nowadays. She wrote a trilogy of books on Thomas Cromwell, one of the eminent English historical figures. And those books were informed by her deep research of history, but more crucially, they were now turned into a remarkable historical series. And what historical series like this show us is that you don't have to invent stuff. You don't need to add your interpretations to it if you just follow what happened. So one of the issues, for example, with Ridley Scott, let's say Napoleon, is he completely invents one of the crucial battles, right, of Napoleonic era, Battle of Austerlitz. The way he portrays it is absolutely fake. But if he had just portrayed what actually happened, it's no less dramatic. The scene of Napoleon on the eve of the battle, riding along the army, and the army being lit up by the torches as the soldiers wake up and cheer him. I mean, that's one of those moments that really you can get the goosebumps. And so I think that one of the challenges, I think, for all these filmmakers is that to resist the temptation to add to history instead of just simply look at what happened.
Speaking of historical films, how do you think the audience for historical films changed over the years?
I'm not sure actually about that they changed really. We all really appreciate good story. I think that still stays. And that, in many respects, the problem with some of the movies that we see in recent years is that they spend $200-300 million on a movie, but the story is not there, and that story doesn't click with moviegoers. On the other hand, I think we can also see that there are a lot of small movies with good stories that click with the audience, and I hope that this moment, we're maybe in a moment where the big budget films are finally on the kind of on the way out, and instead we'll get to the more story-driven products. But I think the audience is there. My students, when I talk to them about history or about the movies, a lot of them actually look back to historical films from 1950s and 1960s because they like how the story is told. One of the actually things that I'm always surprised is when I teach the course on World War I show them 6 different films. And the films that they really connect the most are films All Quiet on the Western Front, which is from 1930s, and The Path to Glory, which is from 1950s. Those are the movies when they rank at the end of the semester that they find most interesting because they are about human experience.
Speaking of stories, we both started, we were born during Soviet Union and grew up in a very turmoil world because of what was going on here in Georgia and the collapse of Soviet Union, and then civil war and regular war, you name it. We had everything. Our generation went through the and then both you and I, we went to the United States, and our story continued there.
Yes.
How did the United States influence your career and your life?
Everything I have is because of the United States. I would say that as a professional. My character, my being was shaped by Georgia, but everything I accomplished as a professional is because of the United States. If there's any 2 words that come to my mind when I think of the United States is freedom and opportunity. And there's, of course, intertwined concepts. When like so many of us, I would say most of us, at least people that I know who went to the United States from Georgia, I went there with barely no money, right? I went there without knowing anyone, and yet this country welcomed me and gave me opportunity in terms of people that I met, opportunity in terms of scholarship that I was extended, opportunity in terms of the freedom to pursue your interests, right? And that is such a remarkable luxury, and I understand it every time I travel to around the world, even when I come to Georgia, and I come and I realize how really fortunate I am to be working in Western archives when my colleagues here have no opportunity to work at the archives because those archives are denied to them. So how do you want to be a historian of the Soviet era? How do you want to reassess history of the past 100 years if you don't have access to the archives? And it is one of the fundamental elements in the historical profession. So to be in the United States where you have resources, freedom, support to pursue it, it's really one of incredible experience.
Do you think the famous concept of American dream is still alive?
You're looking at one.
Yeah.
I'm the tangible example of it.
Yes, and that's very important because some people are saying, American dream is dead and everything. I don't think so, and I don't think it'll ever die.
I'll tell you this. So I left 2000 with literally $300. Of them, $200 of borrowed money. And I went to straight from Tbilisi of 2000, where we barely had any electricity and hot water and or the kind of gray atmosphere, and I flew straight to Miami, Florida, which was like a different universe.
Right.
And one of the first things I did, I went to the local bookstore, and I remember that feeling when you go into a regular, back then it was Borders bookstore, run of the mill, nothing unusual, but they had a history section that was almost half of this room. And I would go there, and everything I wanted to write has already been written about. And so one of the first things I did, I spent almost everything I had, almost all of my money on the books.
I'm sure, I did that same thing when I first time went to the Barnes and Noble.
And then you go back home and you're gonna look at this.
Because I was very interested. See, you reminded me of a funny story. I was always very interested in ancient Egyptian history. Since I was a kid, I read about. And then I go into Barnes and Noble, just like that, in Seattle, Washington. That's where I was studying. And I see all these albums, like beautiful, huge albums, and they're like really cheap.
Yeah.
So I bought so many of them. I had and then I read through them, and then I had to move, and I had to give it to my friends because I couldn't take those books because it's so big. Yeah, I went through that same experience. What would you tell young Georgians who are just starting to touch their dreams? What would your suggestion be?
I think maybe it's a cliche, maybe it's kind of old-fashioned, but not to give up, because dreams require hard work. Dreams require perseverance, determination. There are a lot of obstacles on the way to accomplishing your dream, and the key factor is that resilience, right? Is to overcome the obstacles, to overcome the challenges, whether it's a financial, whether it's support, whether it's opportunity, in order to reach the certain level. Same example, from my experience to when I was here in 1990s and working on Napoleon, a lot of people were kind of making fun of it. And from a modern kind of
I'm sure,
point of view, sure, meeting a kid in post-Civil War Tbilisi who is obsessed with Napoleonic history and searching for all the little necks and crannies about Napoleon, it's kind of funny. It also may be perceived to be almost insane. But I was fortunate that I stuck with it. I stuck with my dream, and I was also fortunate that I met people. And I think that's the second advice that I would give, is that it's to ask for help, ask for advice. I met a lot of people, and I've never been a shy person in terms of kind of reaching out and saying, "Listen, this is what I do. Can you help me?" Mm-hmm. And one of the examples I'll tell you is in 1998. I was working in the foreign ministry, and we had a mission from Council of Europe that came here to examine penitentiary system of Georgia. So they went to different prisons, and the head of this delegation was a great guy from Sweden. And so in one of the meetings, I was sitting there in the corner, and he just started talking to me, and I just told him, "Listen, I know you're from Sweden. Tell me about House of Bernadotte that rules Sweden," which of course was the house established by one of Napoleon's marshals. And he just smiled at it. He's like, "You know about it?" And I'm like, yeah. So we started talking about it. And then the next thing, I kind of brought up one of the historical figures I've been always fascinated about, a young Swedish count who tried to save the royal family during the revolution. And this guy was absolutely amazed by this. And so we spent an evening talking about this. And then when he went back, he sent me several boxes of books about history, right? Swedish history, European history, all paid by him, and he invited me to go to Sweden. I mean, and this is started by through conversation and me asking, "What do you think about this?" Same, I could name a lot of different examples where a simple letter, a simple reaching out, and sharing your passion with somebody actually produces tremendous results. Yes, so I would advise them: be resilient, work hard, and reach out.
Yes, and today one of the most talked about subjects is AI, artificial intelligence. For you as a historian, how do you see it? Do you see it as a new and more efficient tool, or some sort of a problem?
I would say both. And let me start maybe with negative, because as a historian, I'm well aware of the enormous impact that new technology can have on the way we live, the way we produce, on the way our economy functions. In my own lectures, I have discussions with my students where I ask them to compare, for example, the rise of electricity, self-propelled vehicles at the beginning of the 20th century to what we're experiencing now, because that was a really disruptive technology that came on being. Imagine being one of the carriage drivers in Paris, London, or even in Tiflis, and then next thing you know, you're obsolete because now you have self-driving cars, right, where you and your horse is no longer needed. But of course, technology also creates opportunities, tremendous opportunities, and I think this is where the balance. Short-term, AI will create enormous dislocation. But I think long-term, there are so many new opportunities that will come with artificial intelligence. But we'll need to change how we educate. We need to change how we train our professionals. We'll need to change how we prepare for that new and bright future. Because in many ways, menial tasks that nowadays take so much of our time will be obsolete. Mm-hmm. We will, in 10, 15 years of time, we'll have literally AI available in everywhere around us, capable of providing information, doing calculations, or processing information that is menial. So the question will be, what that freed up time, what that freed up potential that AI will offer us, how it will be used. So in our education, in the pedagogy, I actually embraced AI. So I incorporate it in my lectures, I incorporate it in assignments. I make sure that by the time students finish my courses, they have basic understanding how AI can be used for history. So to give you a sense. So previously, let's say we have 40,000 letters of Napoleon, right? Mm-hmm. It's textual. So in order to make sense of them, you have to go by letter by letter yourself. Right. Nowadays, no longer you need that. You can create an AI chat box, let's say, and ask it to analyze each letter and identify patterns by year, by month. So things that would have taken me months, if not years, can be done by AI in a matter of minutes. So I think we will be moving away from history or teaching being rote memorization, which always been wrong, to something more analytical, interpretive, which should be more effective.
So, speaking of AI, since we are living in an interesting era, for my interviews, I came up with an idea. I asked AI to generate a couple of questions.
You're outsourcing your own?
Yes. I asked AI to generate a couple of questions about Napoleon. Now, so it's not me, it's AI asking a question. So the first question by AI is, if Napoleon could see the world today, what do you think would surprise him most about France and Europe?
I think the level of diversity would have surprised him. Europe has changed tremendously since Napoleon's death in 1821. I think the level of freedom would have absolutely surprised him. Napoleon was not. We can talk about him as a reforming figure, but we also need to remember that he's an authoritarian figure. He's the figure who is the precursor of, in many ways, modern surveillance state. So for him, the level of freedom, democratic, experiment that is ongoing in Europe would have been really, really surprising. But on the other hand, I think he would have been also quite pleased with from his kind of statist point of view, with the enormous power that state now can wield. Talking about surveillance, he could not. He set up a system where police were kind of listening and collecting information on a district level. Now you don't need to have agents on that scale. You can just simply track people by their phone, by the internet, by the different surveillance. So I think he would have been.
He would have been a big fan of AI.
Yes. Oh yes, he would have been. Yes.
Yeah. Well. Second question by AI. Did Napoleon ever truly aim for a global empire, or was his vision limited to only European dominance?
I think to a degree he envisioned France as one of the global empires, because his letters are full of reference in early years to France having a colonial empire that spans both sides of the Atlantic. He had plans for India, he had plans for parts of Near East. But of course, all of those plans effectively are negated by the British supremacy on the seas. So in the second half of his reign, after 1805, 1806, the best he could have hoped, and he himself realizes that it is an empire that is dominant in Europe. So I would say parts of it, some global, mostly European.
This question, lots of children today ask, why should I learn history? Why?
Well, let me maybe change. I'll start by saying this. They should not learn history if it's all about dates and simple memorization.
Exactly.
They should not. If there is somebody teaching history that way, it's wrong, and it's actually counterproductive. It's not just the problem of Georgian pedagogical system. I see a lot of the same things in the United States. In fact, the first assignment that I give my students, my freshman students, and it's a bonus assignment, is an essay that's the question is, why do I hate history? And I give them this assignment to understand where they come from. And almost always the answer is, well, history is not interesting, it's boring, that it's all about dates. And of course, that is not history. They should study history because who they are is history. The traditions, the customs, the experience, the things that are passed from generation to generation, the environment in which they grow, the problems that they have faced, political, social, cultural, economic problems, they are all integral part of history. For those young people who are standing on the Rustaveli Avenue day after day for the past few weeks, they are living history, but also they are experiencing history because the problems creating exactly all at once. For them standing there without realizing why they're standing there, right? It's defeats the purpose.
Yes, and we're living in a history right now, and I'm so proud of those children, and I'm so proud of everyone who will become the big part of the history that future generations will embrace and appreciate. And the last question, your family is a Georgian American family.
Yes.
And your children are growing up in America. And what kind of America and what kind of Georgia, and at the end, what kind of world would you wish for your children in the future and grandchildren?
Free. I think if I'm looking for a single word, I think I want Georgia that is free. I want the United States with greater freedom, with greater opportunity. United States is a remarkable place with a land of opportunity, but I think there is always place to improve, and certainly there is a lot more for Georgia to accomplish in that way. Because I always tell my children, and I have two of my own, and my wife and I were in the process of adopting a wonderful baby girl. But for all three of them, I've always told them that hard work, resilience, commitment, kindness, generosity, all of this should be part of not just them, but of the society that they envision in the future. And all of it starts with the freedom to be who you are, with the freedom to express who you are, with the freedom to pursue what you want. So that's the future I want to see.
Great. Well, thank you very much, my friend. It was great meeting you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.